Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the early months of 1968, during the Vietnam War, a battle erupted that would redefine the nature of modern conflict. Set against the backdrop of a war already dragging into its second decade, this clash unfolded in the towns, cities, and countryside of South Vietnam. It was a pivotal moment in a conflict that pitted the world's most powerful military against a determined, resourceful enemy fighting for survival and revolution. This episode examines a battle that redefined war, reshaped nations, and exposed the limits of even the most powerful empires. It was a clash that shattered illusions, revealing the brutal cost of overreach and the resilience of an underestimated enemy. The men who fought it endured unrelenting chaos, street-to-street combat, ambushes in ancient cities, and the weight of a war spiraling beyond their control. Its outcome altered the course of the Vietnam War, weakened a superpower's global standing, and gave rise to the asymmetric warfare we see today. The lessons learned and ignored continue to influence military strategy, international relations, and how leaders justify wars to their people. Let's now experience the Tet Offensive.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 89, The Tet Offensive, the 31st of January to the 2nd of February, 1968. North Vietnamese Forces, roughly 84,000 soldiers, mostly comprised of Viet Cong. United States and South Vietnamese Forces, exact numbers are unknown. The spectacle of communist forces unleashing a coordinated and relentless assault shook the American public to its core. Confidence in the war effort crumbled, and the nation's collective resolve unraveled. This seismic shift in opinion set the stage for the United States' retreat from Vietnam and the inexorable rise of communist dominance.
When the French abandoned Southeast Asia in 1956, licking their wounds from a bitter defeat, the United States surged into the void, determined to prop up an anti-communist regime in South Vietnam. The Geneva Accords of 1954 had promised national elections, but Washington was certain of one outcome: a sweeping victory for Ho Chi Minh that would cement communist control over Vietnam. Refusing to risk that outcome, the United States backed away from the electoral process entirely. In the wake of France's departure, South Vietnam's fragile government limped along under the nominal leadership of Bao Dai, a ruler with little more than ceremonial power. Bao Dai's ineffectiveness quickly gave way to Ngo Dinh Diem, a man who embraced the United States economic and military lifeline with open arms, eager to secure his grip on the fledgling nation. French educated and deeply Catholic, Diem surrounded himself with fellow Catholics and loyal family members, packing his government with those who often treated South Vietnam's overwhelmingly Buddhist population with disdain, even with hostility. From the north, Ho Chi Minh's government actively fanned the flames of rebellion in the south, fostering communist insurgents who came to be known as the Viet Cong. Paranoid and convinced that Buddhist monks were secretly aiding the Viet Cong, Diem's regime unleashed a campaign of brutal persecution against them. Such attacks against revered religious figures and sacred sites alienated swaths of the South Vietnamese population. Even apolitical citizens indifferent to communism began to gravitate toward the Viet Cong simply for their opposition to Diem's tyranny. Diem's response was as predictable as it was ruthless: an escalation of crackdowns targeting anyone in the Buddhist community suspected of sympathizing with the Viet Cong. By the time John F. Kennedy entered the Oval Office in January of 1961, Diem's oppressive methods had begun to trouble the young president. Initially, Kennedy appeared reluctant to wade into the quagmire of Southeast Asia, a problem he had inherited from Eisenhower's administration. But after the humiliating failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, Kennedy grasped a harsh truth. He couldn't afford even the faintest perception of weakness against international communism. With renewed resolve, Kennedy turned his attention to South Vietnam. committing to shoring up the fragile Diem government. Kennedy issued occasional warnings to Diem, urging him to ease his iron grip lest he jeopardize vital American support. For a time, Diem would feign compliance, only to revert to his heavy-handed tactics once the scrutiny eased. In November of 1963, the mounting pressure culminated in Diem's assassination, a grim episode that carried the tacit approval of the United States. Some argue that Kennedy, on the brink of abandoning Diem, hesitated to act, only for his own life to be cut short weeks later. When Lyndon Johnson took office, he too seemed reluctant to dive deeper into Southeast Asia's turbulent waters, but by early August of 1964, everything changed. Johnson informed Congress that U.S. warships had been attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, just off North Vietnam's coast. Bolstered by the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted him near unanimous congressional support, Johnson set his sights on crushing the communist threat to South Vietnam. By February 1965, Johnson greenlit Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive aerial campaign aimed at forcing the communists to the negotiating table through relentless airstrikes. But the plan backfired. Rather than pushing the communists to negotiate, it fueled their resolve, leading to an uptick in their military activity, and inevitably, a surge in U.S. troop deployments. By late 1967, the American presence had swelled to 500,000 soldiers stationed in South Vietnam, their numbers a stark symbol of the growing conflict. Though pockets of anti-war sentiment began to stir across the country, the majority of Americans still saw the intervention as a necessary part of the broader Cold War strategy. Containment of communism had been America's foreign policy doctrine since the late 1940s. Every week, U.S. military spokesmen paraded before the cameras, ticking off body counts of communist casualties as the markers of progress and victory. By early 1968, the prevailing sentiment among Americans was clear. Victory was just around the corner. But at the end of January, that perception would be shattered in a way no one could have foreseen. In North Vietnam, the communist leadership spent much of 1967 in heated debate, wrestling with their strategy for a decisive strike. The government that had replaced Diem was showing unexpected stability, while American forces attacked with near impunity across the southern landscape. The communists were determined to defend North Vietnam from invasion, but more immediately, they were desperate to stabilize their crumbling military position in the south. Communist leaders believed that a bold, overwhelming offensive would ignite a mass peasant uprising in the south, seize control of major cities, and deal a crippling blow to the government. Vo Nguyen Giap, the brilliant strategist, made his move. He would send North Vietnamese Army regulars to launch a diversionary attack on the U.S. ARVN base at Khe Sanh, situated just south of the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel. As U.S. and ARVN forces rushed north to Khe Sanh, the southern countryside and its cities would be left vulnerable, barely defended. The task of assaulting cities, towns, and military bases fell to the Viet Cong, who gathered an impressive 84,000 fighters for the upcoming offensive. In the final months of 1967, North Vietnam methodically prepared the battlefield, setting the stage for an audacious strike that would reverberate around the world. They shrewdly floated the idea of peace talks and requested a truce for the Tet Festival, the sacred celebration of the Asian New Year, knowing it would catch their enemies off guard. Understanding that the South Vietnamese government vehemently opposed negotiations, Hanoi gambled that whispers of peace would sow discord between the U.S. and its allies. In the months leading up to the offensive, North Vietnam funneled massive stockpiles of supplies into the South, a Herculean effort that couldn't entirely evade U.S. intelligence. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, warned Washington of an impending enemy offensive, pinpointing the Tet holiday at January's end as the likely flashpoint. His warnings, though, fell largely on deaf ears, even when the opening salvo struck Khe Sanh on January 21st, 1968. Zop's gambit worked flawlessly. U.S. and ARVN forces diverted reinforcements north to fortify Khe Sanh exactly as he had intended. On the fateful night of January 30th to the 31st, with half of ARVN's forces on holiday leave for Tet, the Viet Cong unleashed their long-planned offensive. The Viet Cong struck with astonishing coordination, targeting 5 of the 6 major cities, 36 out of 44 provincial capitals, and nearly every military base across the South, a staggering 100 targets in all. In Saigon, the audacity of the assault reached its zenith. Just after midnight, the U.S. Embassy compound came under siege, with fierce fighting raging through the night and into the dawn. Thousands of Viet Cong guerrillas secretly infiltrated into Saigon the week prior, turned the city into a battlefield of brutal house-to-house combat. 4 entire Viet Cong corps surged into action, from the demilitarized zone in the north to the far reaches of the Mekong Delta in the south. Amid the chaos, 7,500 North Vietnamese army troops swept through the defenses of Hue, the historic imperial capital, overrunning U.S. and ARVN forces with startling speed. Within hours, the NVA seized control, hoisting their flag over the ancient fortress and executing 2,800 civilians accused of aiding the Americans, a massacre that stained the streets of Hue with blood. This atrocity became the largest political massacre of the war to date, marking a chilling shift in the communists' use of political terror. Westmoreland reacted swiftly, dispatching reinforcements, but retaking Hue would prove to be an ordeal of grueling combat and staggering costs. Reluctant to further desecrate the ancient city, commanders held back from unleashing the full might of artillery and airstrikes. What followed was a relentless grind, house to house, street to street, for over 3 weeks of unyielding battle. It wasn't until February the 24th that the city was finally declared secure, its battered ruins bearing witness to the ferocity of the struggle. With Hue reclaimed and its defenders crushed, the Tet offensive sputtered to a halt, its momentum spent in the blood-soaked streets and shattered strongholds of South Vietnam. It took weeks of relentless U.S. and ARVN operations to reclaim all the Viet Cong's hard-won positions, but one by one, they were swept aside. Zop, ever the cautious tactician, had long feared the overwhelming strength of U.S. forces in direct combat, and his fears were grimly confirmed. The doctrine of guerrilla warfare demanded patience, a war fought in the shadows until the enemy could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Only when the balance of power shifted decisively could open head-to-head battles be risked. It was this strategy that had spelled doom for the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when the communists finally seized the upper hand. The Tet offensive laid bare an uncomfortable truth for the communists. They were far from achieving the kind of strength needed to take on U.S. forces directly. While precise figures remain elusive, it is widely accepted that the communists suffered staggering losses. 40,000 dead, with 5,000 of those killed in the harrowing fight for Hue alone. By comparison, U.S. forces lost approximately 1,100 men, while ARVN casualties were slightly more than double that number. A stark reminder of the uneven cost of this conflict. The human toll on civilians was catastrophic. An estimated 45,000 were killed or wounded, and a staggering 1 million were left homeless, their lives reduced to ashes amid the chaos. Every grand ambition the communists had envisioned collapsed in the face of brutal reality. The peasants, far from rising to welcome the communists as liberators, largely stayed silent or they fled. In fact, when U.S. and ARVN troops recaptured towns held by the Viet Cong, the locals often betrayed their occupiers, handing them over without any hesitation. The government of Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Thieu, though battered, stood as firm as ever, defying Hanoi's hopes for its collapse. The vision of communist strongholds rising in the southern cities proved to be nothing more than a fleeting mirage. The Tet Offensive marked the communists' most devastating tactical defeat of the entire war. In its aftermath, their leadership could do little but puzzle over how such an audacious plan had unraveled so catastrophically. The Viet Cong bore the brunt of this disastrous campaign, their forces so thoroughly decimated that they would never again operate in full-strength units. The collapse of the Viet Cong left the North Vietnamese army shouldering the burden of the war in the south, a strain that stretched their manpower and supply lines to the breaking point. By every traditional measure, the Tet Offensive should have been a decisive turning point, heralding the beginning of the end for the communist war effort. Yet in a bitter twist, the outcome defied all logic. What unfolded was the exact opposite of what one might expect, a result neither Giap nor Ho Chi Minh had envisioned. Reflecting on the aftermath, North Vietnamese General Tran Do admitted, quote, "As for making an impact in the United States, it had not been our intention, but it turned out to be a fortunate result," end quote. For months, the American public had been assured that the war was firmly under control, that communist forces were on the verge of collapse. Yet now they watched in shock as waves of enemy troops struck nearly everywhere at once, and they demanded answers. Where had all these soldiers come from? Weekly body counts touted as proof of progress suddenly seemed suspect. If those numbers were real, how had the communists mounted an offensive of such scale? Worst of all, every harrowing moment of the Tet Offensive played out on the evening news, in living rooms across the nation, searing itself into the American consciousness. Not even the sight of General Westmoreland standing resolute in the embassy compound could restore the public's shaken confidence. Doubts festered. Was it all a lie? The public latched on to early, erroneous reports that the communists had briefly seized the U.S. Embassy, a notion that proved difficult to dispel no matter the truth. Though ultimately false, later corrections were met with skepticism. Too little and too late to undo the damage. The American public saw the shocking images of Viet Cong breaching the embassy compound. What they didn't see, what the cameras didn't linger on, was the overwhelming U.S. and ARVN counterattack that obliterated communist forces in the aftermath. A grim perception took hold in the American psyche, a sense of a stalemate or perhaps even outright defeat. The anti-war movement erupted with newfound intensity, and previously obscure members of Congress found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their dissent broadcast into homes across the nation. As the 1968 presidential primaries began, Lyndon Johnson faced fierce challenges from Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, both outspoken critics of the war, their voices echoing a growing public discontent. From the moment Rolling Thunder marked the escalation of U.S. involvement, Johnson had dutifully answered his advisors' unending pleas for more troops, more resources, and more time. They always promised the same: just a few more men, just a little longer, and victory would be assured. Even in the wake of the Tet Offensive, General Westmoreland maintained the refrain, reporting a devastating blow to the communists and insisting that with the enemy on the run, just a few more men would finish the job. Johnson, however, had reached his breaking point. Disillusioned and weary, Johnson addressed the nation on March 31st, delivering a speech that would shake the political landscape. He announced an end to the bombing in North Vietnam as a gesture of good faith, a desperate bid to draw the communists to the negotiating table. And then came the bombshell. With a heavy voice, with resignation, Johnson declared, quote, "I will not seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party," end quote. To the public, Johnson's words confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The war was not going nearly as well as the military had claimed. The public's growing discontent sealed Johnson's political fate, forcing him to retreat from the stage. Into the void stepped Richard Nixon, campaigning with the dual promise: law and order at home, and peace with honor in Vietnam. In the wake of the Tet Offensive, the American people no longer clamored for victory. They wanted something simpler, more urgent, an end to this war. Though it would take 5 agonizing years to finalize the withdrawal, the war, for all intents and purposes, was already lost. Vietnam became the United States' singular and humbling setback in the Cold War, a conflict not of firepower, but of a faltering national will.